Yo, this is The Civil Fleet, the podcast focused on activist-led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe, with me, Ben Coles. In today's episode, we are going to speak with Jeff Crisp. He is formerly of the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, and now part of a campaign group called United Against Inhumanity, UAI. So Jeff is going to tell us all about UAI, why it was set up, and how it is trying to get European politicians, not just in the EU, but outside of the EU, across all of Europe, to treat people at its borders humanely. And they recently released a manifesto called Stop the Inhumanity at Europe's Borders. So Jeff is going to tell us all about that manifesto. We're going to go through some of the points in there. And we touch on tons of issues that are happening right now, including the far-right protests that have been happening in the UK against asylum seekers. We talk about the Labour Party government in the UK's handling of refugees. We touch on Italy and Albania deal. We even talk about the US. So there's a lot to this episode. So I hope you enjoy it. Before we get into today's episode, I'd like to remind you that the Civil Fleet is not just a podcast, it's also a news blog with reports and investigative stories and interviews and all kinds of stuff. If you go to civilfleet.com, you can find out more there, though it has been kind of inactive recently, but it will start again. And the other thing you can do is you can help us. You can do two things to help the Civil Fleet. If you like what we're doing and you want to help us to spread the amazing voices, the amazing people that we've had on this podcast, then there's two things you can do to help us. You can share us around, tell us your friends about it, tell your friends about the podcast, share us on social media, give us reviews on podcast apps and all that kind of stuff. And you can donate money. You can give us hard cash. If you like, you can go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet, and on there you can make a small donation and you'll get access to a bonus episode on there. The Civil Fleet is totally grassroots. It's entirely self-funded by me. Our costs are really, really small. It's not like we need a load of money. I've got a full-time job anyway, and I would probably do this thing for free anyway. But any support you can give us will be greatly appreciated and will motivate me to do more and more episodes and to put more effort into this thing. Anyway, that is enough of me. Let's get on with the show. I'm going to turn on my recording over here. Turn this up. And
it's just audio. It's just audio.
Yeah, it's just audio.
Yeah.
I'm not ready to subject the world to my face just yet. Only a few people
Yeah.
have seen it. All right, Jeff, shall we get started?
Sure.
All right, Jeff, thank you very, very much for coming on the Civil Fleet podcast.
My pleasure.
I've wanted to get you on the podcast for a while, Jeff. I think I messaged you probably 2 years ago or something. I remember us having a Twitter conversation about getting you on the podcast at some point. But when I saw you share this manifesto, I thought, I've got to read that. And then when I read it, I was like, I've got to get Jeff on. So I'm really glad you come on to talk to us.
Nice to be with you.
So before we start, you recently put out, well, not just you, but an organisation called Stop United Against Inhumanity. You put out a manifesto on ending Europe's inhumanities at its borders. But before we talk about that, I'd like to ask people to tell us about themselves. So I know a bit about your background, Jeff. I'm really interested to hear. Can you tell us about yourself and how you ended up sitting here now?
Sure. Okay. Well, I started off in the academic world. I did a PhD on workers in Ghana's gold mining industry.
Wow.
In West Africa. And when I finished my PhD, I published a thesis as a book, got a job lecturing at Coventry University, did that for a couple of years, but got a bit disillusioned with the academic world and started to look around for alternatives. So for a couple of years, I went into freelance journalism and writing and editing. Then met my wife, decided I needed a more regular income, started to look around for a job, opened the paper, and one day and saw a job advertised with the British Refugee Council as head of publications and communications. And I thought, well, I know nothing at all about refugees, but I do know about publications and communications. So I put in for the job and got that job, which was great. I did that job for a couple of years and then was seconded to an organisation based in Geneva called the International Commission on Humanitarian Issues. I wrote a book for them about refugees called Refugees, the Dynamics of Displacement.
Oh, wow.
And that was noticed by UNHCR, also in Geneva. And UNHCR basically said, would you like to join UNHCR? So I joined UNHCR primarily as a journalist editing a monthly magazine. This was in the pre-web days when publications were the main form of communication. Spent a couple of years, or 2 or 3 years, working in that capacity with UNHCR. Then moved into evaluation of UNHCR programs, then moved to set up a new policy unit in UNHCR, and then eventually UNHCR decided to combine policy and evaluation in one unit. So I spent about 10 years as head of policy and evaluation in UNHCR, working on a whole range of refugee issues, migration and asylum issues around the world. Then I reached the age 60 and they kicked me out, compulsory retirement. And I didn't feel I was quite finished. So I went to Washington, D.C. in the US and worked as head of policy and advocacy for an NGO called Refugees International. Worked there for a while, then decided to come to the UK for family reasons and came to Oxford because I had helped to set up a refugee studies centre in Oxford in the early 1980s and had always maintained good links with them. So when I said I was moving to the UK, they offered to give me a desk and an affiliation. So for the last few years, I've been based at the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford, but also working a lot as a volunteer with a very small NGO, advocacy-oriented NGO called United Against Inhumanity. So that's where I am today.
That's a really great background. I don't think I've had anyone with such experience on here before. So that's really great. So how long ago was it that you left UNHCR?
Sorry, when did I leave?
Yeah.
About 2013 I left.
Okay, so it's been a few years now, I guess. Since you were there.
Yeah.
I always notice on Twitter you're quite prolific on Twitter. I quite enjoy following your account on Twitter. I mean, you're sometimes quite critical of the UNHCR and IOM and stuff.
I am partly because, well, a couple of things. Firstly, when I worked for UNHCR as head of evaluation, my actual job was to be critical of UNHCR's policies and programs and projects. So I always kind of had that freedom to express my views when I was working for UNHCR. Then when I left UNHCR, I felt I was in quite a privileged position. I knew the organisation very well. I'd worked there for 25 years and felt I had an obligation to kind of speak out a little bit on what the organisation was doing and indeed what it wasn't doing. And UNHCR as an organisation is quite sensitive to external criticism. And when it's criticised from people outside, it normally says, well, this critic doesn't really understand the organisation and don't know what they're talking about. Having worked there for 25 years and having been head of policy and evaluation, I was in the privileged position that they couldn't say to me, you don't know what you're talking about. So I tried to use that position in a constructive way. Whether it has any impact or not, I've got no idea. But I think it's useful for a big organisation like UNHCR to have some kind of knowledgeable critics pointing out where it could be doing better.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to do, because when I've seen your criticism and it's not like you just you're like unfairly criticising them. It seems you always have valid points, I think. But yeah. So, and United Against Inhumanity. I keep wanting to say stand up to inhumanity, but it's United Against Inhumanity. Can you tell us about that then? How did that form and who's involved?
Yeah, it's a very small volunteer-based NGO, based both in Geneva and in the UK. We don't have any paid staff. It's purely volunteer-run. It was set up by a group of us who had previously worked for the UN and for international NGOs. Most of us having retired and having a bit of time on our hands, but wanting to keep active in the policy and advocacy world. So really the aim of the organisation is to advocate against the inhumane treatment of people in different contexts, particularly in the context of war, armed conflicts, but also we decided to focus on asylum and on the inhumane treatment of refugees. A number of us who have been involved in setting up UAI and who have been active in it worked for UNHCR, so we know that area quite well. And a couple of years ago, we decided to launch a particular project called Stop the Inhumanity at Europe's Borders. And the manifesto that you've referred to is the manifesto for that campaign. We launched a campaign in London in January 2024. We spent the last 18 months trying to think through the issues, commissioning some policy papers, working on some recommendations. And the manifesto, which has just been published and which is available on the UA website, is really the outcome of that thinking that we've been doing over the past 18 months. And it tries to set out a very clear and accessible set of recommendations to European policymakers, all of them designed to ensure that people on the move, that is refugees, asylum seekers, irregular migrants and regular migrants, are all treated decently, with respect and with humanity. So that's the aim of UAI and that's the aim of the campaign.
Yeah, I think
and I can say a little bit more about the campaign if you want me to.
Yes, please. Yes. Yeah.
So let me just say a few kind of the key features of the campaign. Firstly, our focus is very much on the question of inhumanity and humanity. There are a lot of people out there doing legal advocacy. We're not lawyers. We've tended to shy away from the legal aspects and to focus more on the human dimension of the refugee and migration and asylum situation in Europe. We're not a no borders organisation. We accept that states have a right to control their borders, but we believe that they should do so in a way that respects the dignity and humanity of people who are crossing those borders. The campaign has got a Europe-wide focus. It's not just the EU, it's all European states. And we've steadily expanded the scope of the campaign to include the areas surrounding Europe, particularly North Africa, which of course are heavily impacted by the externalization policies pursued by the European states. So it's a European-wide campaign. It's a civil society-based campaign in the sense that we've tried to get it supported by NGOs, human rights organisations, refugee-led groups and other civil society associations across the whole of Europe. So far, we've got about 160 signatories to the campaign. And we're hoping that with the launch of the manifesto just last week, we'll be able to increase the number of organisations that are supporting us. And it's very much a devolved campaign in the sense that UAI itself doesn't have a great deal of capacity. We've just tried to provide the manifesto and provide a framework which will allow the signatory organisations across Europe to undertake their own advocacy activities. At the moment, the manifesto is only in English, but we will be producing it in French and Spanish, probably in Italian, which will allow the civil society organisations across Europe to do their own campaigning using the manifesto as a basis for their work. So really that's the campaign. But now we're very much aware of the fact that it's quite a crowded space. There are many NGOs, human rights organisations advocating in this area. We think we've got a particular niche with our focus on humanity and inhumanity. And we think we've also got a particular niche in having this widespread support from civil society organisations right across the continent.
I think it's a really good idea to focus on inhumanity as well, because it's rather than like, wow, and actually I'm kind of contradicting myself here, but like I think it's focusing on the inhumanity. I was going to say it's not a moral argument, but of course it is. It's a totally moral, but it's like you can base it anyone. Like it doesn't matter. A lot of people, particularly on the right, sort of focus on people on the move as are they illegal or legal, and that's it.
Yeah.
But even if someone is illegally crossing a border, then you can still treat them with humanely, right? So you should still treat them. The state should
Absolutely,
treat them.
that's exactly the point. We're saying that, of course, legal status matters. It matters whether you're a refugee or asylum seeker or whatever. But we're saying, irrespective of your legal status, you have a right to be treated fairly and decently and with dignity by states and by other actors. In the course of setting up the campaign, we looked at a lot of the existing advocacy. We found that a lot of it is very legally based and is quite technical. It is actually not that easy to understand. I mean, when you go to the intricacies of international refugee law, European law, and national law, it all gets quite complicated. We didn't think we would appeal to a kind of a broad base and to a widespread audience by pursuing that particular kind of advocacy. So again, given the name of the organisation, it made sense to focus on the question of humane treatment of people on the move.
Absolutely. And yeah, I can see on the back, I've got the manifesto next to me here.
Yeah, great.
On the back, you've got it's been signed by did you say 105 or 100 and something?
160.
160, yeah. And a lot of these organisations on here, I can see Open Arms, I can see No Name Kitchen, MSF, Alarm Phone. A lot of these organisations on the back here have been on this podcast. So that's
great.
That's another great reason that you're on here to talk about this.
Okay.
Because they're all linked.
So just to say that the manifesto is up on the website already. We haven't formally launched it. We're waiting for the summer to come to an end, and we will probably launch it with events both in Geneva and in the UK, and possibly some other locations to be decided.
Yeah, that's a great idea. This summer, particularly in the UK, in terms of migration, is going crazy. So maybe it's a good time to wait for the current situation in the UK, at least, to change. So let's talk about the manifesto, and then I think if we have time, we'll talk about the situation in the UK.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's really great, and I like how you have these five clear policies that governments can take to stop inhumanities at the border. So I thought it would be a good idea to just go through some of the main points that you make in it. So like the first section, the first issue that you come up with is saving lives, stop the criminalization of saving lives. I wondered if you could go through these points and talk us through them.
Yeah, I mean, I won't go through each of the recommendations one by one because that would be a little bit tedious. So saving lives is the first kind of priority of the campaign. And here we look at particularly at the issue of search and rescue at sea, the way in which states that used to undertake their own search and rescue activities have steadily withdrawn from that activity, and even worse, have actually made it much more difficult for search and rescue NGOs to operate. So we're calling for states to reinstate their previous search and rescue activities. We're calling on states to end the restrictions that they're placing on search and rescue NGOs. We pay particular attention to the role of Frontex, which we are quite critical of in our analysis and in our recommendations. Now, of course, Frontex is an EU institution, whereas the campaign is a Europe-wide campaign. So Frontex nevertheless forms part of the campaign. And we're also saying that looking beyond Europe, there should be more done to save lives for people who are travelling towards Europe, particularly in the North African context, where unknown numbers of people lose their lives in the deserts, moving up through Africa into Libya and in an attempt to reach the Mediterranean and to cross to Europe. So we're also calling for lives to be saved, not only in Europe and at sea, but also on the routes that lead to Europe.
Because Europe's border basically keeps getting further and further away from Europe, right? I think basically I've had someone on the podcast whose name I'm going to forget from Tunisia, and he talked about how like people in Tunisia can't visit some islands in their own country because they think the security services assume that they might try to get to Europe. That is insane.
In writing the manifesto, we had quite a long debate about whether to use the word externalization or not. Now, it's a word that I use a lot in my own writing, and I'm very familiar with it. And people who work in the refugee and asylum and migration field are also familiar with it. There was a body of opinion which eventually won out in the arguments and discussions we had, saying that externalization as a concept doesn't really mean a great deal to a general public. And as we were trying to reach the general public with our campaign, that we shouldn't use that concept. So in the end, we don't use the notion of externalization, but one of the other sections of the manifesto is called ending containment. And there that explicitly refers to what we would otherwise call externalization, which is the way in which European states have either encouraged or incentivized or induced states outside of Europe to manage migration and to stop asylum seekers from reaching Europe. So externalization is there, but we've addressed the issue under the alternative notion of ending containment.
That's in the part 3, is it? Ending containment, yeah. I wanted to ask about Frontex, and I think everyone listening to this podcast is going to know who they are, but I always just tell people that Frontex is the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. And it's like one of the most well-funded agencies in the EU, I think. We've done a lot of episodes on it. We've had the group Abolish Frontex on here before, but you're not calling for that. Can you just tell us exactly, like, what is the manifesto calling on Frontex to do?
Yeah, I mean, there are many people, and I'm sure you've had them on your podcast, who know a lot more about Frontex than I do. Just to say that Frontex has grown enormously over the past decade. If you look at its budget, it's just gone up exponentially. It's become increasingly powerful. And of course, its primary objective is to stop asylum seekers arriving in Europe. In that sense, and the methods it's used are directly contrary to the kind of recommendations we're making in our manifesto, which are very much about respecting the dignity and the humanity and the rights of people who are on the move. So we call on the European Union to make Frontex much more accountable for its action. We call on the European Union to provide much more systematic training to people working for Frontex so that they have an awareness of the human rights issues involved in the question of border control. We don't call for the abolition of Frontex. It was something that we discussed quite intensively. We decided not to call for the abolition of Frontex, but rather we're calling for it to be made more accountable, to be more rights sensitive, and for its personnel to be much more aware of the issues that we're bringing forward in the manifesto.
Yeah, I thought they were good recommendations.
Whether it's reformable is another question. Some people would say it's not, it should be scrapped and either not replaced or replaced with something different. We've decided to take what you might describe as a more moderate line, calling for its reform. Whether our recommendations relating to Frontex or indeed any of our other recommendations will have any impact, it's not going to be easy because, as you know, we're working in an increasingly difficult environment. And even since the campaign was launched just under 2 years ago, the environment in Europe has become much more difficult, much more hostile to the humanity of refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants. So it's going to be a tough thing to push these recommendations, but somebody's got to try.
Absolutely. Your second section, humanizing reception arrangements. What is this section about, and what are you calling for here?
Okay. Well, again, we start off with the assumption that states have a right to control their borders, but the way in which they manage those borders is very important to us. So we're saying manage your borders, but do so in a humane way. Treat people with respect, treat people with dignity. If people arrive at your borders and want to seek asylum in Europe, allow them in and allow them to submit a claim. Don't push them back, don't reject them, don't push them back at the border. And once you've allowed them into your country, then again, ensure that the reception arrangements that you provide for them are decent in terms of accommodation, access to education, and other social services. Simply treat these people in a decent manner. Now, of course, at the moment across Europe, a lot of people on the right wing of the political spectrum are saying precisely the opposite. They're saying make conditions as bad as possible, put people in tents with no heating, restrict their freedom of movement, basically confine them to camps, because if you do that, if you don't provide them with any kind of welfare benefits, they're less likely to come to Europe. So again, we're working in an extremely hostile environment, but nevertheless, we feel that states in Europe have the resources and the capacity to treat new arrivals who, the numbers can look quite alarming in aggregate, but if you look at them on a country-by-country basis, the numbers should be manageable, and we believe that the states of Europe have the resources required to treat people in a decent manner.
Yeah, and like on the numbers thing, something I always bring up to people is that the numbers of asylum seekers that come to the UK in particular, but also to Europe, is much fewer than the countries near to the countries that produce asylum seekers, I suppose. Like, so Syria, a lot of people from Syria and Lebanon are not here. There's very few that come here, right?
I mean, I've been in refugee situations, outside of Europe where maybe 10,000 people are crossing a border every day and are doing that for a matter of weeks or even months on end. So when you look at the European refugee and asylum situation in global perspective, it starts to look a lot less alarming. Really, one of the points we're trying to emphasize is that 75% of the world's refugees live outside of the developed countries, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and Latin America. And so we feel that European states have an obligation not only to treat refugees decently when they arrive in Europe, but they also have an obligation to assist developing countries that are receiving the bulk of the world's refugees.
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, that's a tough ask at the moment, because just over the last 6 months, starting with the US, but then quickly followed by many European countries, the support that these prosperous countries are providing to refugees in the developing world has been substantially reduced. We're seeing growing levels of hunger amongst refugees around the world. Obviously, Gaza is getting a lot of attention, but in other places, in Chad, Central African Republic, Bangladesh, there are clear indications of rising levels of hunger amongst refugees, and the rations with which they're being provided are steadily being cut. Increasingly in Bangladesh, for example, where you have 1 million refugees from Myanmar, until quite recently, most of the population received food aid from the World Food Programme. Now only the most vulnerable refugees are receiving that assistance, and others have to fend for themselves, despite the fact that they're really excluded from the labour market, not allowed to work, don't have access to land to grow their own food. So I've just actually published an article titled Struggling to Survive, Why the World's Refugees Are Going Hungry. And this is going to be a big issue in the weeks and months to come.
Yeah, I was just going to say I read that article, and I think it's on UII's website, right?
It is, yeah. It just came out a couple of days ago, yeah.
So I'll link to that. I have shown everyone listening; they can see the link. I'll have a link to that article, so people can read it. And I suppose it kind of related to this is another article I've read of yours. I think was in the New York Times, although you had a link to a Google Doc about Trump, the US President Donald Trump, offshoring asylum seekers. Right, he sent people to Djibouti, I think, and Eswatini. I'm probably pronouncing those wrong. And was it South Sudan? He sent people to.
Yeah, exactly. It started out to be a kind of a more general article about the way that refugee and migration policy was heading. Now, because it was the New York Times, they gave it a particularly US twist and gave it a title with Trump right up front. It was meant to be a more general observation that what we see across the world, particularly in the US, but not only the US, is that people, refugees, asylum seekers, other migrants, are being deported to countries with which they have no prior connection. And this is quite a new phenomenon. Traditionally, states have wanted to send people back to their own country, but now when they're confronted with people who can't be sent back to their own country, they're just sending them to completely random places, and often dangerous places. So South Sudan, which has, which is in a terrible position, it's got an armed conflict going on, it's got high levels of hunger, the economy is in really bad shape, and yet people are being sent there who have absolutely no connection with South Sudan. And really, it's difficult to know how they're going to survive when they get there. And of course, this is not just a US thing. As you know, the UK tried very hard to deport people to Rwanda. So if that policy hadn't been stopped by the new government in the UK, we might have had the prospect of people from Syria and Afghanistan and Sri Lanka being sent to Rwanda, which was a country where they'd never had any connection before, where they didn't speak the language, were unfamiliar with the culture. It's very difficult to see how those people would have coped. And it's very difficult to see how some of the people that the US is now deporting. I think I saw an article recently that said that the US is currently in discussion with 58 different countries around the world as potential places where people could be deported. Mm-hmm. And while not all of those agreements are likely to come into force, already quite a few countries are receiving migrants that are being sent by the Trump administration.
Yeah, it's. I mean, this is not related to the podcast really because it's the US, but they've sent people to Nicaragua, which I think you mentioned in your article as well. And I've done a few.
Exactly.
And that's just like Nicaragua's got those really terrible prisons that they've just grabbed like sweep people off the street, but essentially shoved them in jail. Yeah, it's really terrible. And I think you made this point in the article, I think, or I did because I'm so intelligent, that if the US does it, then Europe is likely to start to see it as more humane, I suppose. It's kind of like be leading the way, right? And Italy did have, I've actually lost track of what's going on. I think Italy was sending people to Albania, right?
Well, it built some detention centres in Albania with the intention of sending people that were rescued at sea to them. That notion was struck down in the Italian courts. So the most recent development in that respect, and it's something that I wanted to raise in this conversation, is the question of what happens to rejected asylum seekers in Europe. Now, this is a big issue. Many of the asylum seekers who reach Europe do actually get refugee status and are allowed to stay. But some in the UK, I think it's about 25-30% in the UK, do not get refugee status. And the question is, what happens to those people? Now, according to international refugee law, it's quite legitimate if somebody has sought asylum and their case has been rejected after a full and fair examination of their claim, then they can be returned to their country of origin. I've been quite critical of the advocacy community, particularly in the UK, because this is an issue that they don't really want to touch. Many advocates don't want to acknowledge that it is legitimate for people to be sent back to their country of origin. Personally, I don't have a problem with that notion as long as that person has had their claim fairly and thoroughly looked at, and as long as other regularisation opportunities have been examined. But if there are no regularisation opportunities, if their claim has been fairly rejected, I don't have a particular problem with the notion of people being asked to go back to their country of origin. A lot of advocates, particularly in the UK and in other parts of Europe, are kind of reluctant to take that position. One of the most recent developments is the notion of what are called return hubs, which is some of the rejected asylum seekers in Europe come from countries where they can't be sent back to, either because the situation is too bad, Afghanistan would be one example, or because the countries that those asylum seekers come from won't let them back into the country. So the most recent idea is these detention centres that were used that were set up in Albania by the Italian government, they might be used as so-called return hubs where rejected asylum seekers could be sent pending the time when somebody can work out where they should eventually go and what can be done with them. And UNHCR has also given kind of qualified support to this notion. I'm quite critical of it. I think it's going to end up people being dumped in places like Albania, possibly for months or even years on end, so with no real solution to their plight in sight. And also, in terms of the conditions that these people are living in these return hubs, you've only got to look at these detention centres that have been built in Albania. They look essentially like prisons. So we're talking about sending people who have committed no crime whatsoever. The only thing is that they've applied for asylum but not actually received it, sending them to prison-like conditions for an indefinite period of time without any ultimate solution to their situation. And again, this runs directly contrary to the kind of call that we're making in our manifesto for the humane treatment of people on the move.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation, isn't it? But yeah, that definitely fits in with ending containment, which is what we just talked about. I don't know, is there anything else you could say about this section of the manifesto?
Well, I think the dominant trend in the refugee, asylum and migration policies of the industrialised states, the world's most prosperous states, over the past decade has been this push to get countries, less developed countries, less prosperous countries, to basically act as their agents and to act as agents of migration control. We saw this in an early phase with the EU-Turkey deal, for example. We saw it with the UK's attempt to establish a deportation agreement with Rwanda. And as we've just spoken, we're seeing it very much with the Trump administration, sending people not only to their own country, but also to random and dangerous countries across the world. So externalization has been a dominant feature of the refugee and asylum policies of the industrialized states. In our manifesto, we call for an end to externalization and an end to containment. Again, this is a very tough ask. It's become such a dominant feature of the policies of the world's most prosperous states that getting them to reverse that is going to be very difficult indeed. We just simply have to try pushing on this issue, pointing out the inhumane consequences of externalization, but also pointing out the inequalities. As you mentioned earlier, most of the world's refugees are to be found already in developing countries, and these externalization policies are simply going to reinforce that situation, with just a very small minority of the world's refugees being found in the countries which are best able to support them. So both in terms of the treatment of people, but in terms of global equities and inequalities, we would like to see an end to the so-called externalization, or as we call them in the manifesto, containment policies currently being pursued.
Because I think there's, in Greece, they have migrant camps essentially. I've not seen much about them recently, actually. But and other places in Europe where I've been to a few in Bosnia actually, where people are just sort of left there to while away. Basically, they're just there, and it's a pretty sad situation for those people because what have they done? They've, like you said, they've committed no crime, but they're stuck in these containment centres.
But just to show how difficult this will be, I mean, in the UK, as an example, we were all very happy when the new government came in and immediately ended the Rwanda plan. And we thought this was a great progressive move. And unfortunately, over the past year with the new government, they've moved very much back to looking at externalisation and containment arrangements themselves, with lots of ideas being floated about sending people to other parts of the world. So it's going to be a tough call to get rid of these policies.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunately something that's going to come up more, right? Like you said. And then a really important section is the fourth one, the safe routes. Like, I think people listening to this podcast are obviously going to agree with that. Like, because we've had a lot of people on here talking about rescues in the sea or at the land borders, the border between Poland and Belarus, and places like that. So yeah, tell us about this section, safe routes. I mean,
I've actually kind of done quite a bit of work on safe routes and published a few articles on them. Again, I'm going to be a little bit critical of the advocacy community, my colleagues in the advocacy community, particularly in the UK, where I think the whole notion of safe routes has become a bit of an easy slogan. So a lot of people are saying, safe routes, safe routes, safe routes, this will resolve the whole asylum issue. I think that to some extent, the whole notion of safe routes is being used as a proxy by some advocates for open borders, because they're basically saying anybody should have access to a safe route if they want to, which is tantamount to my way of thinking as saying everybody should be able to cross a border and reach the UK or any other country that they want to. Personally, I don't go that far. So I don't think safe routes are an easy option. I don't think that establishing safe routes is going to solve the whole asylum issue, because I can't see states ever establishing them on such a scale that nobody will have an incentive to move by irregular means. As long as some people can't move by regular means, they will move by irregular means using the services of human smugglers. And I don't think that the establishment of safe routes is going to resolve that situation. Even so, I think safe routes do have an important and a central role to play in addressing the refugee and asylum issue in Europe. What exactly are we talking about when we say safe routes? Well, firstly, we mean refugee resettlement of traditional type, whereby refugees move from their country of origin to a country of asylum in the global south, but are then subsequently allowed to move to a country in the global north by organised and regular means. So we're calling for an expansion of those resettlement programs. We're particularly interested in the whole notion of community-sponsored resettlement, where community groups, whether they're families, trade unions, church and faith-based groups, can sponsor the arrival of refugees from other parts of the world into Europe. We think that that is an idea that needs to be explored more systematically. We're also calling for other safe routes to be opened. Something I'm particularly interested in is what we call labour mobility programs, which allow refugees with particular skills that are needed in the global north to move to those countries, again, by safe and regular means, so that they can make use of their skills, so that they can earn money, send money back home to their friends and relatives in their countries of origin and country of first asylum. We're talking about educational scholarship programs, which would allow refugees in the global south to come and study at universities and colleges and schools in Europe. And we're talking particularly about family reunion programs. One of the reasons why many people move in an irregular way using the services of smugglers is because they want to rejoin family members who have already moved on to places in Europe. And we don't feel that people should have to move by irregular means, risking their lives in the process in order to rejoin their family members. So we're calling in the manifesto for an expansion of family reunification programs, which allow people to get back together with their families in a safe and legal manner. Now, this is being mentioned to some extent in the British context, the UK context, with this new so-called one in, one out deal with France, which would allow asylum seekers in France who have particularly close connections with the UK and who already have relatives in the UK to move to the UK. We think that that is a good idea in principle, but so we're quite keen on the kind of the one in idea, but we're less keen on the one out idea. Again, we don't believe that people should be deported from the UK and sent back to France. We believe that their cases should be examined in the UK, and if they're found to qualify for refugee status, allowed to remain in the country and build their lives here.
With the France and the UK deal, How, like, is the UK going to send us people to France, and then what does France do with them? Presumably, if someone's got a connection, we're not sending people that have got a connection with France because they would already be there. It's quite a strange agreement.
It's a strange agreement. I'm not even sure whether it's actually in operation or not. Nobody seems to quite understand how it's going to work in practice. And it's quite an unusual thing in the sense that it's almost united people on the right and on the left, both of whom are saying this is simply not going to work. Now, they're saying that for completely different reasons. But I have to say, I've not come across anybody from any particular point on the political spectrum who's been particularly positive about this arrangement and who thinks it's going to achieve its intended purposes.
Yeah, it seems like it sounds like it's something that the people in the Labour Party probably think will win them votes, but it's not going to work.
In fact, there's a very good article on the UAI website, which I didn't write. I did some work on it, and I think it's called something like "Asylum Seekers in the UK. Why don't they stay in France?" And it looks at the different reasons why an asylum seeker in France might actually choose to make that dangerous journey across the Channel and to try and make it to the UK. And one of the points it makes is that only a relatively small minority of the asylum seekers in France do actually try to cross the Channel. If you look at the UK media, you would think that every single asylum seeker in France is trying to get to the UK and that they're trying to get to the UK because of their wonderful welfare benefits. And the article that you'll find on the UAE website actually refutes that. It makes the point that relatively few of the asylum seekers in France want to come to the UK, and that those that do want to come to the UK normally do so for very good reasons. It may be because they speak English very well but don't speak French at all. It may be because they've been brutalised by the French police, which has a habit of kind of attacking their settlements, both in Paris and on the northern coast. They may come from countries with colonial connections to the UK. So there are many reasons, and they may already have family members in the UK. So there are many reasons why some asylum seekers, by no means all, some might prefer to cross the Channel and to live their new lives in the UK rather than remaining in France.
One thing I've been to Calais, and quite a few years ago, I met people that were intended to cross the Channel. I don't know if they ever did. I met one guy who tried to swim, and anyway, I was like, please don't do that. But a lot of people, like most people I met, they had a connection. They spoke English really well. They didn't speak French. They were beat up by the French cops, so they didn't want to stay there. But like quite a few people, not just in Calais, but I've met other asylum seekers or people on the move that I've met, want to move to the UK in ways that people on the right would like, because they like our culture, they love football. A lot of people, they just want to. They've been affected by our soft power in the media. They see that the UK looks like a nice place to live, so that's why they want to come here. And you'd think, there's a comedian, I can't remember who he is now, I think he's talking about the US situation actually, but it's like the most patriotic people are the people who've risked their lives to get here because they love it and they want to be a part of it.
Yeah. So one issue I wanted to mention, I think one of the big problems of working in the kind of refugee advocacy space is that people who don't share our opinions, they work on the basis that if you tell a lie a sufficient number of times, people would begin to believe it. And that's exactly what is happening in the UK refugee advocacy space. So the notion that people have an obligation to seek asylum in the first safe country they reach, many people firmly believe that is a principle of international refugee law, which it certainly isn't. International refugee law gives people the opportunity to move on from one country to another if they have valid reasons to do so. You know, the other lie is that everybody's coming to the UK because the welfare benefits are so generous, whereas in fact people in these so-called asylum hotels are actually getting about £7 a day, which is not exactly a generous amount of money. all of this talk about 4-star hotels, well, they might have originally been 4-star hotels, but once you start sticking three or four people in a room together who don't know each other, don't perhaps even speak the same language, if you strip out all of the kind of leisure facilities that these hotels once had, then you come to the conclusion that 4-star hotel is a serious misnomer. So unfortunately, the right-wing ecosystem in the UK is very active on the asylum issue. At the moment, it's perhaps become their number one issue, and they're spreading a very large number of lies and other falsehoods about the situation. And for a small organisation like UAI, we don't really have, the capacity or the media reach to combat those falsehoods which are being told. But I think, we and others will try to counter those misperceptions that people are having as a result of what they see and hear in the media.
It feels like there's we can talk about this in a bit, I think, but it's like a witch hunt almost going on at the UK like every summer, like when Parliament's out, there's usually we call it silly season in the media, where they stories just get blown out of proportion. At the moment, it's all you go on any website, media news website, that is now focused on the hotels and protests of these hotels and legitimate concerns and stuff. But we'll talk about that in a minute.
Well, at the moment, it's a complete frenzy. I mean, and I dread to kind of look at the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or the Daily Telegraph every day just to see what kind of stories that they're publishing. I mean, every single all of those newspapers publish kind of refugee and migrant stories on a daily basis, and they're just desperately looking around for the stories that cast refugees and asylum seekers in a bad light. Now, they haven't quite reached the Trumpian level of they're eating cats and dogs, but it's only a matter of time before they start to publish those kind of stories.
Yeah, it's only a matter of time. I mean, today, as we're recording, today is August the 23rd. There's protest plans out by far-right groups. There's a group called Homeland, really really right-wing, and they're protesting outside hotels and stuff today. But yes,
well, we're now at a situation where, as you know, somebody who tweeted "burn the fucking hotels down, kill the bastards," pleaded guilty to inciting racial hatred, was imprisoned for a relatively short period of time, has just been released from prison, and is now being treated as a national hero by the right-wing media. And including politicians on the right, which is simply disgusting.
It is terrible. And then we probably should have discussed this just for legal reasons, but when I see that compared to what's happening to people who support a particular prescribed banned group in the UK, and the way they're being treated, just don't mention it for legal reasons. That situation is insane. Anyone listening, just go on the Civil Fleet's website and you can see what we're talking about.
Okay, but as you've mentioned Palestine, you haven't mentioned the organisation associated with Palestine.
Oh, we cut it out.
Response to the situation in Gaza. Because if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says that everybody has the right to seek asylum outside of their own country. But in the case of Gaza, there's been a kind of a collusion by the UN and its member states that nobody should be allowed to leave Gaza and seek asylum elsewhere. Now, they say that partly because they don't want to facilitate ethnic cleansing by Israel, which I can understand. Even so, if something is a universal right, it's a universal right, and you can't start making qualifications to it. So I've been quite critical of UNHCR that it's not stood up and said that other countries do have an obligation to allow people from Gaza in if they choose to leave that particular place. Now, there are many Gazans who don't want to leave, who want to stay there, despite the difficulty of life there, despite the murderous conditions that they confront, but some do want to leave, and they've not been allowed to. Egypt has kept its border shut, so they can't get out that way. Egypt is a member of UNHCR's Executive Committee. It's a signatory to the UN Refugee Convention and the Organization of African Unity Refugee Convention. It has closed its borders to make it impossible for anybody to leave Gaza. And UNHCR has said nothing about that, which I'm being quite critical of.
Yeah, that's a tricky situation. The internet was cutting off just as I thought you were going to say Palestine action. But so I think we missed a little bit of that. But yeah, I
value my liberty too much, does it?
But yes, the situation there is just, but every single day it just gets worse, and I kind of run out of things to say about it because it's just so horrific. The situation in Gaza, and I often think because people in Gaza, they actually can't get out; they're just trapped. I have met people on the move from the West Bank. I don't think I've ever met anyone from Gaza, but and it's just awful that they can't get out. But like you said, if it's a universal right, it's a universal. Everyone has that right? And actually, I suppose talking of Palestine and the lack of respect for international law the world over at the moment. The last section in the manifesto is enabling justice and redress. So can you walk us through this section?
Yeah, this is a section which is maybe a little bit more kind of legally oriented than the other sections. We're simply saying that in situations where the human rights of refugees and asylum seekers and other migrants are abused by states, those people should have the right and the mechanisms available to them to seek redress and, if possible, compensation from the states of Europe. It does happen to some extent on a very small scale. We've come across a few cases where refugees have been able to go to the courts and to seek some kind of redress. It doesn't happen on a very systematic or a large-scale basis. And again, it's a question of accountability. If states abuse people's rights, then we feel that those people should have the right to seek redress and seek compensation. And we're calling for asylum seekers and refugees to be given better legal advice about their options for seeking redress, but also for states to make such forms of redress more commonly available.
Yeah, like when I was reading this section, I was thinking about the Pylos shipwreck in Greece. Was it last year, 2023, I think, or 24? I'll have
a couple of years ago, I think.
Yeah, like 600 people died roughly off the coast of Greece, and I think there has been some cases happening against that.
There is some movement on that case. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where it stands at the moment, but there have been some positive movement in that case.
Yeah, but then like at the beginning of the on the pretty much page 2 of the manifesto, you have like 4 situations of people who died while trying to seek refuge in Europe, and the families of these people, like, can they do anything? Like I think that's why this has to be part of the manifesto, right? Like, I was reading, the first one is about some people who died at the border trying to get into Bulgaria. It's just froze to death, essentially, I think, is what happened to them, was it?
Yeah.
And like the guards that stopped them from coming over, they probably face no consequences right at the moment.
Yeah.
So I think this manifesto is needed. It's really, really interesting, and I really hope it gets taken up by. Have you had much reaction to it, like from not just from like people you would expect, but like has there been reaction to it from, I don't know, maybe people on the right or centrists as they're called?
Not yet, but I'm actually posting the manifesto on a number of conservative websites to try and elicit a reaction. So, in fact, just this morning I posted it on the Conservative Home website.
Oh yeah.
In response to an article they've just published calling for mass deportations along the kind of American lines in the UK. So, as a riposte to that, I've just posted the manifesto and put recommended reading for all Conservative Home readers. So we'll see We'll see whether anybody reacts. I don't expect any positive reaction. But I think you've made a good point, which is we've got to take the argument to these people. It is very easy in the advocacy world to spend most of your time talking to people who agree with you 100% or 95%. And maybe one of our failings is we don't take the argument to people who disagree with us sufficiently. So I think that's something that we'll try and to do, in the weeks and months to come. Not just talk to people that already agree with us.
It's so hard sometimes because I know people that will just spout stuff they've heard on, like we're talking about I mentioned, like it's like a witch hunt at the moment in the UK for migrants.
Yeah.
There's one, I think there's a situation in the UK where a man was accused, he's been arrested and I think charged with kissing a minor. He kissed someone, and the trial's still not happened yet. So, and he was in a hotel in Epping, I think, and now the council has won an injunction to stop housing people there, and now the far right are protesting against it. But what I was driving at was when I try to talk to people who are have totally different opinions to me on this situation, is that it's really hard to get through the bullshit. That's what I'm trying to say. And the demonization of these people, and it's so hard. I don't know how we get through that, because if you say people shouldn't drown in the Mediterranean, I think we can both agree on that. And people say, yeah, but they're coming here to take our jobs. They're coming here to steal our women. They're coming here to turn up Europe Islamic, and it's that's not happening.
Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments we can make in this case is to say to these people, were you in support of what the UK did for Ukrainians? We allowed them in. They didn't have to come by irregular means or dangerous means or cross the channel because they were given visas. They were linked up with families in the UK and allowed to find homes with people in the UK. Were you in support of that? And often people on the right were quite comfortable with that. So then you say, well, why shouldn't other refugees be entitled to the same treatment? And it basically exposes their racism, because at the end of the day, they can only say, well, the Ukrainians are more like us, which is another way of saying they're white.
Yeah.
And asylum seekers are black or brown. So you can kind of expose people's racism by using the way that the Ukrainian refugee situation was dealt with and comparing it with the way in which asylum seekers from other countries are treated.
Yeah, and then sometimes you get... I've had arguments like that, and then the intelligent racists will say, oh, it's a cultural thing, their culture's completely different.
Cultural, yeah. Well, sometimes the Ukrainians are Christians and the others are not, but, I mean, okay, not all of the other asylum seekers are Christians, but some of them are.
Yeah.
They come from Christian countries or they have Christian faith then. But if for people to say, well, we simply don't have the capacity, we don't have the rooms in our schools, in our hospitals, in our GP surgeries. Well, we managed to find room for the Ukrainians in our schools and our hospitals and our GP surgeries. So I've never heard anybody say, Ukrainians are clogging up the National Health Service. But as soon as you get an asylum seeker from another part of the world arrive, then immediately they're, a mortal threat to the NHS.
Yeah. I really hate that argument, because it's not them that's causing the problem, it's the funding of the NHS. 14 years of austerity and stuff. But yeah, that's a separate issue. So how are you doing for time? Are you okay for time? So I've got a couple more things I want to ask.
Yeah, a couple, maybe five more minutes, yeah.
All right, let me ask about... you kind of asked this already. What do you kind of hope for this manifesto? What's the dream situation that happens with the manifesto, but then what in reality?
Yeah. I mean, when we started this campaign, we had a kind of naive idea of trying to kind of build a mass movement. I mean, we were particularly struck by the whole refugees welcome movement that started after the 2015-2016 refugee emergency in Europe, where large numbers of people spontaneously joined that movement. It wasn't an organised movement, it was an organic movement. People started to use the refugees welcome slogan without belonging to any particular organisation or subscribing to a particular set of prescriptions. It just became a generally popular movement. You saw the banner being waved even in football stadiums, for example, which was a pleasant surprise. It's not something that we expected to see. So in a way, when we started the campaign, we were trying to recapture that moment when there was genuinely seemed to be a kind of a swell of support amongst the public and amongst civil society in support of refugees and other people on the move being treated in a decent manner. So if we could just play a small part in mobilising public opinion and bringing those people on board and bringing their pressure to bear on politicians and the media, then we would consider that to be an extremely positive outcome. But as I mentioned earlier, I think we're under no illusion about the very hostile environment that we're working in, which, as you mentioned earlier, just in the past few weeks has become particularly intense. And I guess something we're all asking at the moment is, can this level of intensity be maintained much longer, and what's it going to lead to? As you know, there were many predictions, and some people made those predictions in the hope that they would become self-fulfilling predictions of kind of violence on the streets this summer in the UK. So far, other than the asylum hotel protests, we've not seen large-scale violence on the streets, and obviously we hope that can be avoided. But in the current kind of febrile atmosphere, the frenzy around the whole refugee and asylum issue, you simply can't predict what is going to happen, and it could only take a very small incident to spark something much worse. So we're really much hoping that that can be averted.
Yeah, one of the things, there's a million questions I'm trying to say here at once. Let's choose one of them. I read this morning about these protests outside the hotels that are planned today. Robert Jenrick, who's a Tory not minister, he was a minister. He's just like, I don't know what he is. He's an MP for the Tories. He's been flirting and hanging around with these people. Former BNP organiser, he's been photographed next to. And Farage has been saying, Nigel Farage is the leader of Reform, which is the biggest right-wing party in the UK at the moment, sort of. He's saying like, oh, the way to stop people coming to this country is to deport them. But it's not going to stop them. Deported people, they just come back, or other people will come. I don't know what. We're just locked in this loop, this continuous loop of like, let's try to stop the migrants. Let's do something awful. It doesn't work. Let's do something awful. It doesn't work. So that was just me.
I mean, the frightening thing for me is I think a lot of what's happening in the UK has basically been legitimised by Trump and what Trump has been doing. And the scary thing is that Trump has only been in office for 7 or 8 months now. And he's got another 3 years, more than 3 years to go. So you really wonder what is going to happen in that time in the US, and then what kind of ripple effects it's going to have in the UK and other countries. Because clearly a lot of what's going on in the UK has been influenced, I wouldn't say triggered, but at least been influenced in some ways by what has been happening in the US. And so I think I'd like to be optimistic. I'd like to think that the manifesto will reach a broad audience, that people will read it, agree with it, and act upon it. I'm, to be honest, quite pessimistic about the scope for progressive advocacy on the refugee issue at the moment.
There's a phrase, I think it is attributed to Gramsci, but I don't know if he actually said it. Optimism of the will, pessimism of the something. What is it? Of the mind or something like that. I'll link to that. But anyway, yeah. So the last question I'd like to ask people, Jeff, is how do you feel about the future? What can we do to stop it from becoming a dystopian future?
I mean, I am pessimistic. At the same time, I see optimism in the sense that at the local level, you often see refugees and other migrants being treated with a great deal of respect. Local community groups come together to support them when they actually know the people, when they're just like statistics. people get worried. When people get to know them on a personal level, I think attitudes can change. There is a great deal of solidarity that still exists within the British population and in Europe more generally. It's just that, unfortunately, the racists and the haters tend to have better access to the media, speak with a louder voice, and in that respect have more impact. So I'd really like to see those of us who support refugees and other migrants speaking up more loudly, having better access to the media, and making a greater impact on our politicians and the people who control the media.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully the Civil Fleet is some tiny way of doing that.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I think, most of the organisations, when you compare it with the big media corporations, small organisations like Civil Fleet, like Alarm Phone, like UAI, and like some of the others you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, we are very small in number, we're very small in capacity. One can only say that by perhaps linking up, by working together, by trying to work with common messages, that we can make a little bit of a difference and perhaps avert the worst case scenario that we all fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jeff, that's been a really great interview. Really enjoyed talking to you about this. I will have links to your social media and stuff on the notes so people can find you on there. I don't know, maybe, do you know your Twitter handle off the top of your head?
Okay, yeah. You can follow me on Twitter at JFCrisp. And it's the same on Bluesky.
Brilliant. All right, Jeff, thanks very, very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ben. Great to talk to you. All the best and have a great weekend.
You too. Cheers. Bye-bye. All right, that was episode 76 of the Civil Fleet podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks again to Jeff for coming on the podcast and for having such a great interview with us. I really enjoyed talking to Jeff. Wanted to get him on for a while, so it's really cool that he came on the podcast to talk to us. Okay, at the end of the podcast, there's several things we talk about. Why don't you go to civilfleet.com? Go check out our blog, find our news stories, investigative reports on there. We have some old review interviews on there, so go and check that out. You can also support us. You can support the Civil Fleet if you like our grassroots journalism, if you like what we're doing, if you like our independence, and you want to help us to continue to thrive, then you can do two things. One, you can share us on social media, you can tell your friends about us, you can give us reviews on podcast apps and all that lovely stuff. You can like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And another thing you can do is to chuck us some money, help us to keep the lights on, as it were. To do that, you can go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet and you can make a small donation there. It's like £2 or £3. It's probably like $4 or $5. And you get access to a bonus episode and you will help us to keep promoting the voices of the people at Europe's borders. I think I just about got that out of my mouth. So, that is episode 76 and I'll be back again soon. Cheers.